just to maybe start with talking a little bit about the exhibition, which opened at Turner Contemporary in May of last year and ran across the summer until September. Emma, you can obviously say whatever you would like to in a second, but I suppose from my perspective, the reason that we first started talking was really to celebrate the significance of the exhibition that you were curating. For those of you who don't know, it was Ed Clark's first institutional exhibition in Europe, so it was a really significant moment for him. And I think that we wanted to take the opportunity really to gather colleagues in the field who may have developed connections with Ed Clark's work and would be interested to share some insights and thoughts on him. So I think that's really the purpose of today, to have a conversation about the exhibition and his work in general. I'm going to hand over to Emma in a second, but I just thought it would be nice if I introduced everybody and gave a brief bio for everyone. So let's start with Emma. Emma Lewis is a curator at Turner Contemporary. She was previously assistant curator of international art at Tate Modern, where she curated the Dora Maar exhibition, as well as exhibitions on Olafur Eliasson, Modigliani, and Wolfgang Tillmans. She's the author of Photography, A Feminist History, which was published in 2021, and was guest curator for Sue Williamson and Libuhang Kanye at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, which opened in the spring of 2023. Shawanda Corbett is a visual and performance artist whose practice spans ceramics, photography, painting, performance, and film. Her work explores the question of what is a complete body, looking at the different cycles of a human's life through cyborg theory. Cyborg theory describes the breaking down of the distinction between the organic and the synthetic, human and animal, physical and non-physical. Shawanda was born in New York and raised in Mississippi, and now lives in London, having completed a practice-led doctoral degree in fine art at the Ruskin School of Art and Wadham College at the University of Oxford in 2022. Her work is represented in the collections of the Fitzwilliam Museum, the Harris, the Arts Council collection, and the Crafts Council collection in the UK. Amiel Clark is a painting conservator at Julia Nagle Conservation in London, which specialises in the conservation of modern and contemporary paintings. She received her postgraduate diploma in easel painting conservation from the Hamilton Kerr Institute at the University of Cambridge and holds an MA in the history of art from the University of Edinburgh. In her role, she's worked with a diverse mix of private collectors, commercial galleries, and institutional collections in New York and London. She has a special interest in artists' materials and techniques. So thank you again for everyone presenting today. Emma, do you want to start by introducing the exhibition and your experiences of working on it?
To recap, the exhibition included 16 paintings and 2 works on paper that spanned almost the entirety of Clark's career, so from the late 1940s right through to the early 2000s. And it followed a broadly chronological layout, but I think with our medium-sized galleries, we really conceive this as a focus survey on Clark's work. As Ali said, Clark's work hasn't been shown in depth, really outside of the States before, and outside of kind of beyond the 1950s and 60s. And so this is an opportunity to introduce Turner's audiences, local, national, and also increasingly international audiences, to Clark's work in depth and to show the range of his practice. Equally, we're also mindful about what it means to show his work in Margate at Turner Contemporary. And a couple of things I think we really wanted to come to the fore with that. And one of them is networks and communities. So we look at various different points in the exhibition at the communities that Clark made for himself. But you'll remember that in the first room of the exhibition, we focus on the time that he spent in Chicago at the Art Institute, and then in Paris, and then the communities that he built for himself in Paris and New York, coming and going kind of back and forth between those two cities that he made his home. And in preparation for the exhibition, something that we thought about quite a lot is the idea of community within Margate, and the idea of what it means to show his work somewhere where people do congregate and do find peers and a kind of a place for their artistic practice. So that was very resonant. Equally, there's also the effect of the fantastic views, the landscape in Margate itself. And so a major focal point of the exhibition was the work that Clark made, inspired by his trips around the world. We looked at his famous trip to see Jack Whitten in Crete in 1971, where he subsequently realizes the impact of the colors, the light, the atmosphere of the Mediterranean on his work, and then seeks to travel, kind of curious to see how exploring very different parts of the work will impress themselves upon his work. And so these incredible shaped canvases and monumental canvases made in the 1970s especially were, you remember, the focal point of the North Gallery. Equally, it was interesting in putting the exhibition together to think about the trajectory of a very, very long career by all accounts, and how this interest in travel and real preoccupation with materiality manifest over the years in his work. So it was for that reason important to include works on paper, to see how he translated that interest in place, but also his interest in materials into a different medium, with the dry pigment works on paper that we included. And then concluding the exhibition, looking at how his interest in form really shifted. I mean, we're talking over almost a 30, 40-year period, from the rainbow works to the broken rainbows to the waves. So there's definitely a through line in his practice that came out in the selection of works and hopefully came out in the curation. So I think something that was an interesting curatorially was how to represent that through line while also naturally showing how much an artist's practice shifts over the years and decades. Thanks to the Jonathan Ruffer Curatorial Award, I was able to go and visit the Ed Clark papers at the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian, which is an incredible resource on Clark's life and work, very well catalogued. And as we know, it's not all that common for an artist's life and work to be as well documented as Clark's was. And it really enabled us to see, maybe to have a deep dive into the way that his work was received during his lifetime. Is kind of one key aspect of his life and work that we wanted to get across in the exhibition, but also the relationships that he had with other artists and other peers, poets, writers as well. I mean, the extent of the correspondence section of the archive is incredible, and naturally, because of the way the archive is, it's we only see the correspondence that he received by and large, but I think, and again, it enabled us to see the networks that he built for himself in the different communities. Where the archive became specifically very important in the exhibition was, as I mentioned, identifying works that were very important in his lifetime. The Broken Rainbow series is one that really stood out, and there were works that had been particularly well documented, I think in around the 1986, 1987. Clark was photographed with the work for editorials. He also had the works photographed while they were in progress, and they helped us. That documentation helped us to answer questions about what works were, because remember, works are still being discovered kind of in his studio, and in far from his death, the kind of canvases are being unrolled. Helped us to identify what the works were, how they should be oriented, and also to understand where they fit within his broader practice. So, for instance, a work that's in the Broken Rainbow work that was in the last room of the exhibition, which we loaned from a private collection on the West Coast, that had originally been catalogued as a work from the mid-90s and actually displayed at a different orientation. The archive showed us that, in fact, it should be oriented in the reverse, and that it was, in fact, from the 1980s. And that was important because it enabled us to see the Broken Rainbow series as a kind of coherent, very decisive and intentional body of work at that in that moment of Clark's practice. And I mean, in addition to that, I think were the more personal archival materials, and material that showed how Clark was working, almost the performative nature of his work as well, kind of working with the 48-inch push broom on the canvases. And by having that documentation, some original, some facsimile in the exhibition, I hope that it added a depth to the experience for our audiences of kind of connecting with Clark's work. I should add as well, most of it came from the Archives of American Art. There was also a great deal from Amiel Clark that included photographs, exhibition invitations, great photos of Clark with his friends and peers as well.
Would you say, as a curator, is it quite important for you to have access to the archive in that way? And is it common for you to be able to refer to it within the exhibition itself?
I think it's incredibly important. I think as a curator, I feel like it's essential to really understanding a late artist's work, and I think understanding an artist's work in their own words is, I feel like that's paramount to me personally as a curator. And so to have the archive available and such a rich archive as well was incredibly important. And yes, I think for an exhibition like this, that is, as I say, a focus survey, by which I mean it's spanning the entirety of his career while also being, necessarily limited to 18 works. I think that it allows a sort of depth of engagement for audiences that is really important. Because again, it's a huge period of time we're talking about, from the 1940s to the early 2000s. And then in a kind of simple but I think equally important level, it's a human story, and as compelling and as immersive and important as the artworks are in their own right, I believe that audiences also connect strongly on a human level with the artist's story, and it means a lot to be able to see the artist and understand something of their personal experience in the world and what it meant to be an artist at the particular moment in that particular place. And the archive helps bring all of that to life.
Yeah, I think the exhibition was really guided by biography and was able to present, his journey from, New Orleans, Chicago to New York to Paris. Like that came across like very strongly, and it was such an important part of understanding the exhibition, I think. Helped, of course, by the archival materials.
I think in describing some of the archival, some of the archival critical material that's in the Ed Clark monograph that was recently published by Hauser, the editor, I think, describes an art critic as narrativizing Clark's life, which I think is an important thing important sentiment to bear in mind, that it can be very tempting to narrativize biography and to make it kind of neat and to make make a certain story out of biography. So that's something that I try to bear in mind as well. It can't be, I guess, too neat. The kind of messiness of life has to come in as well. But I think within the confines of archival vitrines and limited space of wall text, I think there are ways to kind of get that nuance across.
Emma mentioned about it's really much about his life, and what I really was very admired by how, like nowadays artists, we are just assume that we make a one type of work and we stick with that one type and one style. To see his work really transform over time was very eye opening for me, and it kind of like add a relief. Um, I was introduced to his work uh, back when I was in high school in Mississippi. And so we didn't like go to any, galleries and things like that. Prior to that, it was just training as personally was training as a traditional painter. You go through you know, the the still life and things like that. Everything is stationary, and it's classical, it's part of it you have to learn. And when we got into like abstract expressionism and introduced this work, I was like, yes, this is it. I like this. It speaks more to me. You have more movements. You're not just sitting down, you're thinking and using everything that you have. And this is a different way, it's a different visual language that is actually quite universal. We all can relate to it in so many different ways. It's not specific to uh, the states. It is something that we all can relate to as far as like horizons, and it gives a lot of motion and movement. And it can be seen as something that you see in like cinematography when the camera is in motion, or even when you're looking at something very fast, very quickly, and it gives that type of like, it's very, I want to say bodily. I mean, you know what I mean? Like when a person is moving, it gives that. Whether it's like you're looking at something straight on or it's like peripheral, it is quite unique, and it kind of gives a like an insight of every person have their own perspective. It's like a it's like a fingerprint. It's very unique, and it's okay to express how you see things, how you do things differently. And that's not just like a lesson within for artists, for all artists. It's just a great lesson like in life, which is really great. His work really represents how can you just really move throughout the world, move within your work regardless of what field you work in, and and sticking to that. And it's and your point of view is a lifelong trajectory. Like it doesn't stop, it always continues. And so like seeing his work in in person, finally I got to see how sculptural it is. And there's such a relief, like a relief sculpture in his, especially with his work with the push broom, and that kinetic motion is it has its own, I would say, like own you know uh terms and things like that within like ceramics and sculpture and things like that. Just to see it in painting, it opens a whole new way of thinking about imagery, the way of painting upright, painting with things laying down on the floor, and taking things, materials, and you know going outside of a rectangular square surface and really make something of your own, or just a complete statement, different statements, different storylines that you can come to. And I think it's something that, especially growing up on a coastline, it definitely brought me back to being on in the South. um Spend a lot of time on the beach, so it's like getting back to that and feeling that coastal presence, especially being shown at the Turner Contemporary. It felt like the Mississippi coastline, and it was just, it felt like home, which was really was very, very welcoming.
What you're referring to also, you mentioned Clark working with the broom, and there's this sense of the body being within the paintings, not just the mark making, but the way that he's actually approaching the canvas and wanting to make the work. Um, I mean, I was interested in your background with cyborg theory, and I'm just really curious as to any kind of connections that you're sort of seeing through your own work, and how you think about approaching your work, and some of the things that you've just said. And maybe for those of us who don't know too much about cyborg theory, if you could maybe say a bit about that.
Cyborg theory is really a social political term that started with Donna Haraway in her text of Cyborg Manifesto, which is talk about feminism and using technological terms to explain women's rights, but in a different plane. And so what I wanted to do was to just add more to it. Not to say that her perspective is problematic, but it's just her perspective. And so it just opened up an opportunity to add my perspective in that. And in relation to Ed Clark, what I really found useful is ceramics, within ceramics, you're taught to kind of make like a machine, like the human touch is taken out traditionally. And with ceramics, I wanted to start recording how my body moves with the clay, how the clay reacts to the wheel, the speed of the wheel as well, and just adding different pressures and things like that so it can change and move through the firing, which is a lot in Ed Clark's painting. And I just love that physical, you know, just recording of the body movement of the time, what he's thinking and everything else. And you can see a lot of his traditional training in art in those decisions, in the colors, in the mixing, and every decision that he has. But what's the best part of that, and which really connected within my work, is the art of letting go. When you're taught so much and you're like you know use a lot of technology, not technical terms and things like that, that goes within your practice. And the art of letting go is just let things flow freely. And and your practice is like a muscle memory, you will always have it, but it's just to be more intuitive and more connected with the time, the here and now.
One other thing that you said that was interesting was that you actually first found out about Ed Clark's painting through school, presumably through looking at his work in books, which is really interesting because I think that it suggests that he does have a presence within American art history. Would you agree with that? Do you think that, in terms of your generation, that he's an artist that you've kind of grown up with in that way?
Yeah, well, on the, living on that Mississippi coast, so I'm in a similar proximity to New Orleans and things like that in other places in the area. So we're familiar with his work because of his background. And also, like, it is, you know, uh, the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So there's a lot of local artists that is influenced by the way he paints and the things that he makes. So they make a lot of references. His work is referenced a lot, um, within the local artists group and people.
And it really kind of draws attention to the fact that Clark is a Southern artist in that way, isn't it? That that really they're his roots, and he talks a lot about that and the importance of, I think, being from New Orleans.
I wondered, Shawanda, I was curious about your experience of the oval works in particular, or just your thoughts on the fact that Clark talked about the oval shaped canvas as being more naturalistic, as like a kind of natural experience. And I guess in that way he's implying I don't think he ever went into it in too much depth, but an interest in how to kind of break down the normal experience of seeing or engaging with a canvas, a rectangular canvas. This idea that that there is something kind of more organic about that experience. And I think sometimes the way that those shaped canvases are discussed, it reminds me of your work. It makes me think about the way that Allie had described your interest in kind of breaking down the experience as well. So I was just interested in your thoughts on them.
Yeah, I found myself spending a lot more time in front of those particular works because it felt like, um, gazing into someone else's viewpoint and their vision, and how interesting how that, because, and I think we, with the traditional rectangular and square canvases, gives an idea of this is how we look at things, but we actually have to move our eyes around and search the entire thing to see the shape itself. But with the oval, you can sit right in front of it and stare right into it and see the whole thing, because that's how we naturally see things, and which is quite good, with uh, compared to like circular parts of the vessels that I make. If you break them down, they're all elongated oval shapes, and it gives you an idea of how image fits on that. So that does contribute to how I see and how I lay out uh, images on circular vessels, because on their what is called oh goodness, the silhouette of the vessel broken down, they're all just oval shapes, different, elongated, more um wider, but they're oval shapes essentially.
I had the pleasure of condition checking Egg Clark's painting with my colleagues Olympia Diamond and Julia Nagel during the installation and de-installation of the Turner Contemporary exhibition. And this was brilliant because this process allowed us to consolidate our existing experience with Clark's work and gain further insights into the specific materials, techniques, and the conservation challenges they present. Today, I'd like to share some of these insights with images to highlight the unique materiality of his surfaces from a conservation perspective. Clark's signature technique of using a wide push broom to spread poured paint across canvas creates really striking and very idiosyncratic visual and textural effects. These could be easily overlooked, so I wanted to take this opportunity to draw your attention to some of them now. Working with the canvas on the floor, Clark poured paint of varying dilutions using the broom to distribute it. Each surface records his physicality, with the paint revealing subtle shifts in his gait, pace, and grip. For example, you can kind of see here and across the surface that jogs and wavers in the sweat bands suggest redirections or inconsistencies in his motion as he wielded the broom across the surface. Down this area here indicate Clark's speed and the resistance of the flat canvas to the brush's pressure. Thicker passages of pooled color, like this very juicy swathe at the top right, signal moment when momentum slowed and the brush lingered and came to a complete stop. The paint, which typically was acrylic, had a thicker, more viscous consistency. It retained the dragged impression of the broomstick bristle, like here. And this created a characteristic ribbed or channeled texture, as I said, exemplified here on the left. You can also see that where the paint was swept wet into wet, hues blend seamlessly, forming soft transitions between the colors. Pooled colors at the end of strokes bleed into each other, creating marbling effects that you can see in this kind of image on our right. And I think that's one of the really beautiful things about looking at his surfaces, is you get these muddling of colors. In these next images, you can see scattered air bubbles, which are a very common feature inherent to the big sweep that could be misconstrued as losses. And these are caused by the sweeping motion aerating the actual paint film, and the air bubbles are burst, leaving these tiny craters on the surface. Wrinkles, like here, and drying cracks also naturally occur in the layered passages, with aperture sometimes revealing colourful underlayers. Now again, these are inherent features that could be misinterpreted as damages. And while they should be monitored, they are typically very stable. Close inspection of Clark's works reveal various inclusions were incorporated into the wet paint film during the creative process. And among these, you might find following. So here we have staples. These might be fully encased, protrude somewhat precariously, or have been plucked from the surface, leaving behind shallow unpainted beds, like in this example just here. You can also find hairs and brush bristle inclusions. Sometimes, as in this little example, they leave linear impressions behind, which again can be mistaken for damages such as cracks. We also saw many paint skins and flakes, and even twine and paint soaked canvas threads are not uncommon to find on the surface. These features attest that studio debris reached the surface while he was working on the floor, and that he integrated it into the final work. While Clark's technique might appear spontaneous, he was very deliberate in creating the final image, and his careful decision-making is evident repeatedly. Archive photographs are wonderful resources. In other works, later colourful splashes are deliberately overpainted to prevent them from distracting from the intended surface effect. You can see in these examples, bright blue splashes have been toned to re-establish the uninterrupted horizontal reading of the painting, especially here you can literally see where he's reconnected these horizontal bands. Clark built up and excavated layers, carefully refining the surface to achieve the desired effect. In this painting, he deliberately applied and removed tape layers to preserve specific drips or swathes of paint he liked and didn't want to be lost under later layers. He also used boiling water to achieve, quote, a breaking of the hardened upper surface of pores. This specific description was recorded by the Brooklyn Museum's conservation team when his painting was brought into their collection. It not only gives a fantastic insight into this particular creative history of the work, but highlights how proper conservation documentation is vital to our interpretation and understanding of an artist's materials and techniques. Another notable feature of Clark's painting is his use of tape. He often applied tape to his surface, painted over it, and removed it, creating horizontal or oval channels. I'm going to see here. This is exemplified in this painting, Iffy Rose. Sometimes the tape was not released, but remained embedded in the paint surface. These paint strips can exhibit puckers, like these, and creases. And the drying of paint on top can cause the tape profile to bow and form slight gaps between its edges and the surrounding paint film, like in this image here. In some works, like Untitled from the Brooklyn Museum, here, Clark applied wide strips of glossy black gaffer tape, which I think in the US is called electrical tape, leaving them mostly unpainted to add further texture and luster to the work. And for us, the awareness of such tape inclusions is essential to safely cleaning these artworks and documenting them. Regarding conservation, Ed Clark's works are generally in very good structural and aesthetic condition. Interestingly, tape residues and soiling from packing are common features on larger works. These tape remnants are not to be confused with the deliberate tape inclusions on the front. And you can see in this image, again from the archive, that Clark himself would use gaffer tape in the studio to secure rolled canvases here up at the top register here. And this would often be done, as exemplified in this image, without an inch leaf of wrapping material. When unrolled, larger works often have these cut tape remnants. Again, you can see them on the back of this work. And they also usually have a distinct band of soiling where the canvas was exposed and accumulated dirt. A trained conservator should remove these remnants and later soiling because they can degrade the original surfaces and become more tenacious with age. These conditions also highlight the importance of proper handling and packing, which should be done under the supervision of conservators and trained art handlers. Another universal recommendation to protect his paintings, like this one here, is to protect them from exposure to UV and strong sunlight. This will help maintain the vibrant color palette and preserve areas where there are expanses of raw unpainted canvas that are naturally more sensitive to light degradation. A key consideration for the Turner exhibition for us was stretching the large format painting Iffy Rose, which hadn't been stretched since the 1970s. When the painting was unrolled, we discovered original markings on the reverse. You can kind of see here the outline of the stretcher and various different inscriptions, and they indicate the desired size and positioning. These were previously undocumented, and their discovery allowed a stretch to be made to the correct dimensions, put it in their correct orientation, and precisely align the artwork. Ensuring the horizontal bands of color and the oval were positioned exactly as Clark had intended. As other works by Clark may not have been stretched yet, we do advise collaborating with conservators and stretcher makers to ensure their safety during the stretching process. This is especially important because his geometric compositions must be precisely positioned, and thick paint buildups around the sides are less likely to be cracked and damaged by experienced hands. Turner Contemporary for the Ed Clark show was really rewarding. By engaging with a significant body of work by a single artist, we deepen our understanding of their creative practice. It allows us to recognize inherent features, identify typical conditions, and develop informed approaches to preservation. This is especially critical when working with modern contemporary paintings, where unconventional materials often introduce new challenges. As conservators, our mission is to safeguard these exceptional works, ensuring they endure for future generations to experience.
I think one question I have is really to do with context and what your experience might be of working on artworks that were made in the period that Ed Clark was working, and whether you can find similarities between the way that artists are physically making work and what you find when you're conservating those works.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really kind of interesting thing that the minute you have paintings flat on the ground as opposed to up on an easel, you have this very tactile sense of their environment, whether it is bits of stew debris being put into the paintings or the kind of the sense of the body, like them actually moving around the canvas. You can kind of think of Pollock, who you find cigarette butts and pin tacks and things from his studio. And, you know, you get the sense of his motions being recorded in the paint film, very similar to Ed Clark's, which I always find fascinating, this kind of human traces, you know, where he's kind of really driven a paint film. You get the sense of his physicality. And that's one thing I really loved with the exhibition, that you have these images of him wielding the brush, so you could really imagine it really clearly. But I do think that, you know, this was a particularly unique process of using a push broom. You know, other people were working by kind of dribbling paint and dropping things on the surface from above. But I do think that his surfaces, his paintings are really quite unique in that sense.
What's it like working on artworks that are actually such so large in scale as well? And how does that change things for you?
It's kind of incredible. The first interaction I had with an Ed Clark painting was back when I was working in New York. And we had an incredibly large canvas that quite literally filled our studio. It was stretched. And I think we had about that much space between the top of the canvas and the ceiling of our studio. And it's incredible because you're completely engulfed by it. And when it's vertical and you're up close to it, you can really see all these lovely nuances in the surface texture. And then when you're stretching canvases and they're on the ground, they suddenly feel really small again. So it just really kind of makes you very aware of your own body and the way that they just completely absorb a space. And I think given with his larger work, they often have that real sense of horizontality that you kind of get drawn into them, and you're reading them from kind of one side to the next, you get really sucked in. So from a conservation perspective, it's quite interesting when you have your optovisors on and you're up on a cherry pick or whatever, and you're looking at them really close.
What also came across in your presentation is that, you know, as you said, the works were in excellent condition for the most part. You said structurally, you know, I think a lot of that has obviously to do with work still being discovered as well. They haven't even been shown before. And I think one thing that will be coming up in the future is, you know, obviously we want more Ed Clark exhibitions, and there's going to be a lot more movement of these works. So that would automatically start, well, changing how the existing body of works has been maintained, I suppose, and how to continue to preserve the works as they move around the world.
Yeah, and I think there's always the consideration of making sure that, you know, because so many of these paintings are so large, they have to be rolled. They can't fit through doors. They have to go through freights, and so there's a huge amount of preparation that goes into that from the kind of logistics side and conservation in, you know, safely rolling these works. Typically, the acrylic paint films are quite supple. There's a danger of cracking, but again, it's really important to be mindful of the surfaces and condition check them before they go anywhere to make sure that, you know, they are protected and can transport as safely as possible wherever they might go.
Yeah, that was so fascinating, Amiel, to see the detail. And I think what comes across really strongly is precision involved in Clark's work. Because I probably, like a lot of people I have spoken to, interpreted many of his works as being very spontaneous, the kind of the gesture and the movement. But there's also this very precise, very carefully planned, maybe methodology is too strong a word, but certainly intent behind the works. And I love seeing the close-ups of the wet on wet as well, because the great close-up you had of Yifei Rose and the pooling of those paints looks very similar to work that he would make in the 2000s, like a kind of macro, like the works in the 2000s macro of the detail from the 70s, which is really satisfying to see. I wondered if you could say something about what the introduction of acrylics did to his practice in terms of his color palette, and how for artists during that period, how acrylic changed the possibilities in terms of the kind of the material possibilities, but also in terms of the tonal ranges available to them. Because I think as works came out of the crates during installation, that shift in palette was like very
well, they just zing. They really pop. The colors that are available are incredible. But I think one of the kind of key things is that with oil paints, it's such a slow process. You might have to wait months before the surface is actually dried, whereas you have the expediency with acrylics that they dry faster, and you can dilute them with all sorts of things, so you have some kind of range of handling possibilities and kind of textural effects which you can really experiment with. And I think that was the great thing at that time, is that because you weren't hindered by the constrictions of time, you could be sweeping paint across the surface and it'd be dry a few hours, a few days later, and then keep adding to it without muddying things. You kind of retain the precision of the layers below often. You get these gorgeous color palettes, which are just gorgeous to behold, really. Yeah. I suppose also the other thing is you have the kind of sense, like with the broom in this instance, aerating the paint, you get things like the kind of the air bubbles creating craters. With oil paints, often they get they're described as, with oil paint, because you have the time, that's more of a slow process. Those things are often kind of lost. You really get the immediacy with acrylic paints.
Emma, where do you think Ed's work will go next? I think that the exhibition that you curated was seen by a lot of people, made a really big impact, and was able to raise Ed Clark's profile quite substantially. The hope obviously is for that work to continue.
Well, I'm sure that the work will continue to be seen in group exhibitions as scholarship on, particularly on this moment in the 1950s and 1960s of American in Paris, as that scholarship comes to the fore. And I also hope, as we know that he did, for a larger scale retrospective in the States. And I think because of this growing interest in his time in Europe, as that is building, I think it's also really important to think about kind of the long-term interest and inspiration that artists like New Orleans artists and artists of the American South that have found in his work for decades. So I guess bringing together the how to say, the generational impact of his work in certain communities with the new scholarship, I hope those two will connect. I hope that his work will also be kind of acquired by more institutions internationally as well.
Thank you again for everyone for being here this afternoon. I'm really glad that we were able to have this conversation.